black boy stands up in court, and what he says makes the judge turn pale. The trial was supposed to be simple, but when a black child spoke, everything changed. The judge, known for his harsh rulings, turned ghostly pale. The jury stared in disbelief. What could possibly have been said to shake the foundations of the courtroom? The air in courtroom 317 felt like concrete in Darius Taylor's lungs. Heavy, suffocating. The 14-year-old's palms left damp prints on his pressed khaki pants as he watched his father, Nathan Taylor, stand before Judge William Caldwell, with shoulders squared but eyes downcast. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that deepened the lines of worry etched on his father's face. Darius had never seen his father, a man who coached Little League on weekends and graded history papers late into the night, look so small. Judge Caldwell peered down from his bench, fingers steepled before him. The gold of his watch glinted as it caught the light, a silent reminder of power and privilege. 6 generations of white judges had presided in this courthouse, their portraits lining the hallway outside, like silent sentinels of a system built long before anyone inside this room was born. A system that had somehow, despite the passage of time and laws, remained fundamentally unchanged. The defendant will remain standing while the prosecution delivers its closing statement, Judge Caldwell announced, his voice echoing off marble and mahogany that had been polished to a shine by courthouse staff who looked like Darius but would never sit where Judge Caldwell sat. Assistant District Attorney Patricia Reynolds rose with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat in this room. Her cream-colored suit crisp and immaculate, her voice practiced and precise. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, scanning the 12 faces, 10 white, 2 Asian, who would decide Nathan Taylor's fate. Not a single face reflected Darius's own. What we have here is simple. An officer of the law, performing his sworn duty, was assaulted by the defendant. Officer Thompson's testimony was clear. The defendant became aggressive, threatening, combative. Darius felt his grandmother's hand grasp his. Grandma Olivia's fingers were thin but strong, the strength of a woman who had marched in Selma and survived to tell about it. "Breathe, child," she whispered, but her eyes never left the front of the courtroom. Defense attorney Michelle Chen stood next, her final appeal filled with passion that couldn't quite mask the resignation in her eyes. She'd fought this battle too many times before, in this very courtroom, against this very judge. The statistics were in Darius's father's backpack. Judge Caldwell sentenced black defendants to 38% longer sentences than white defendants charged with identical crimes. The evidence simply doesn't support the prosecution's claims, Ms. Chen argued. Mr. Taylor has been an upstanding teacher in this community for 15 years. The alleged assault was not captured on any of the officers' body cameras, which were conveniently malfunctioning. We only have their word against his. Judge Caldwell's expression remained impassive, but Darius had become an expert at reading micro-expressions over the past 3 months. The slight tightening around the judge's mouth, the almost imperceptible nod when the ADA spoke, the subtle shift in his chair when Ms. Chen mentioned the missing footage. His father had taught him to respect the system. "It's imperfect," Nathan had explained after dinner-table discussions about the news. "But it's all we have. We work to improve it, not dismantle it." Now that same system was poised to take his father away for something he didn't do. Grandma Olivia's grip tightened as Judge Caldwell began his instructions to the jury. Each carefully chosen word seemed tilted toward guilt, laden with subtle assumptions. The air in the courtroom grew thicker, pressing down on Darius's chest. "Before you deliberate, remember that the testimony of law enforcement carries the weight of their oath to protect and serve this community," Judge Caldwell intoned, his gaze sweeping over the jury box. Something hot and electric surged through Darius's body. 3 months of helplessness, of watching his mother cry at night when she thought everyone was asleep, of seeing his father's colleagues disappear one by one, of overhearing courthouse staff murmur, "These people always have an excuse." It all crystallized into a moment of clarity. Before he could think about consequences, Darius was on his feet. "The recording," he said, voice cracking but carrying clearly across the suddenly silent courtroom. Judge Caldwell's gavel froze mid-air. "Young man, sit down immediately or I'll have you removed." "The recording," Darius repeated, stronger now. "The one they deleted from my phone." The effect was immediate and electric. Judge Caldwell's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. Ada Reynolds dropped her pen, scrambling to retrieve it with uncharacteristic clumsiness. Officer Thompson, sitting in the front row behind the prosecution table, shifted forward with sudden alertness. "Bailiff," Judge Caldwell called, his voice unsteady, "remove this young man from my courtroom." But something had shifted in the air of courtroom 317. The jury members leaned forward, expressions curious. A reporter in the back straightened, pen poised. Darius's father turned, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and something else, a flicker of hope. Those two words, "the recording," shouldn't have meant anything significant. They shouldn't have made a veteran judge turn pale. They shouldn't have caused the prosecutor's hand to tremble as she shuffled papers that didn't need shuffling. But they did. And in that moment, as the bailiff moved toward him, Darius stood unwavering. Generations of silenced voices seemed to straighten his spine as he locked eyes with Judge Caldwell. Something about those two words had shifted the power in the room completely, and everyone, most of all Judge Caldwell, knew it. 3 months earlier, the evening air had been warm with late summer promise. Darius remembered the squeak of his basketball shoes against the polished gym floor, the satisfying burn in his muscles after practice, the normalcy of sliding into the passenger seat of his father's sedan. "You're driving lower on defense," Nathan had said, pride evident in his voice as they pulled out of the school parking lot. "Coach Jenkins noticed that improvement yet?" The memory played in vivid contrast to their present reality. The flashing lights had appeared suddenly behind them, red and blue slicing through the ordinary evening. Nathan had signaled, pulled over carefully, hands visible on the steering wheel as he'd always taught Darius to do. "License and registration," the officer had demanded, flashlight beam aimed directly into Nathan's eyes despite the early evening light. "Officer Thompson," Nathan had read from the nameplate, voice steady and respectful. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" The question, polite, reasonable, had somehow escalated everything. Within minutes, Nathan Taylor, who had never even had a speeding ticket, was spread-eagled against the car, then handcuffed on the roadside while Darius watched, phone recording trembling in his hands. "Stop resisting," Officer Thompson had shouted, though Nathan hadn't moved except as directed. "He's not resisting," Darius had yelled, his adolescent voice cracking with desperation. Later, the police report would claim Nathan had swung at the officer, had threatened him, had resisted arrest. The assault charges elevated a routine traffic stop to a felony case that threatened to destroy everything the Taylor family had built. "You need to eat something." Darius's mother, Leona, placed a plate before him at their kitchen table. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, evidence of sleepless nights spent at their dining room table, surrounded by legal papers and dwindling savings accounts. Darius pushed the food around his plate. "Mum, we need to talk about the recording." Her shoulders tensed. "We've been through this. Your father's attorney says, Ms. Chen says the recording was corrupted when they returned my phone. But I know what I saw, what I recorded." "I believe you." Leona lowered her voice, though they were alone in the house. "But believing isn't enough in court, and bringing it up again could make things worse." The weight of adult worry looked wrong on his mother's face. As assistant manager at Riverside Community Credit Union, Leona Taylor had always projected steady confidence. Now she jumped at unexpected sounds, checked the locks twice each night, and had taken to scanning the street before retrieving the mail. The Taylor family's descent had been swift and merciless. Nathan suspended from teaching with partial pay that barely covered their mortgage. Legal bills mounting daily. Friends and colleagues slowly disappearing from their lives. The PTA meeting's tonight, Darius noted, watching his mother's face carefully. I'm not going. But you're the secretary, and Dad's name might come up with the curriculum review. Leona's hands trembled slightly as she rinsed dishes. Amanda Wells texted me, said maybe it's better if I skip it until things blow over. She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Amanda used to bring us casseroles when you were born. Sat right there crying happy tears when you took your first steps. The betrayal hung in the air between them, unspoken but palpable. At school, the whispers followed Darius through hallways like persistent shadows. Heard his dad went crazy on a cop, a voice murmured as he passed. My dad says there must be more to the story. Teachers don't just get arrested for nothing, another responded, loud enough to ensure Darius would hear. Principal Donovan had called Darius to his office twice now, the first time to offer generic reassurances about presumption of innocence. The second time to suggest, with careful corporate phrasing, that Darius might want to temporarily step down as class vice president for his own well-being. Only Ms. Rivera, his English teacher, seemed to truly see him. She'd extended deadlines without him asking, placed books on his desk about young people fighting injustice, and once after class simply said, "Systems weren't built to be fair, Darius. They were built to maintain power. Remember that when they tell you to trust the process." At lunch, Darius sat alone until Tyler Washington dropped his tray across the table. "You look like hell," Tyler said by way of greeting. "Thanks for the update." "My uncle got picked up last year. Same thing. Resisting arrest when he was standing still." Tyler took a bite of his sandwich. Nobody believed him either until someone posted a video from across the street. Darius looked up sharply. "A video?" "Yeah. Some lady on her porch caught the whole thing, posted it online and tagged the police department. Charges disappeared real quick after that." Tyler studied Darius's expression. "You had something, didn't you?" Darius pushed his tray away. "I recorded everything on my phone, but when they took it as evidence and finally gave it back, the video was corrupted. Unwatchable." "They think that's the end of it," Tyler said, lowering his voice. "They always do." That evening, Darius sat cross-legged on his bed, while Grandma Olivia braided his younger sister Zora's hair in the next room. Their voices drifted through the thin wall. "Grandma, is Daddy going to jail?" 7-year-old Zora's question pierced Darius like a physical pain. "No, baby. We're not going to let that happen." But Mackenzie at school said, "People say a lot of things, child. That doesn't make them true." Darius squeezed his eyes shut. He'd failed to protect his father that night, had stood frozen recording when maybe he should have. What? What could he possibly have done differently? His laptop glowed in the darkening room, open to a cloud storage login page. A notification flashed in the corner. Automatic backup complete. 94 files synchronized. Darius stared at the screen. His phone had been set to automatically back up photos and videos before the police had taken it, before the recording had mysteriously corrupted. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as a new kind of tension gripped him. If the backup had worked, if the video was intact, using it would mean confronting not just Officer Thompson, but Judge Caldwell, ADA Reynolds, the entire system that had conspired to destroy his father's life. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Grandma Olivia stood in the doorway, her eyes knowing. "You found something," she said, not a question. "Maybe." Darius's voice felt tight in his throat. "But I'm scared. What if it makes everything worse?" Grandma Olivia crossed the room and sat beside him, the bed dipping slightly beneath her weight. She took his hands in hers, turning them over as if reading his future in his palms. Your great-grandfather, William, kept journals during Jim Crow, documented every injustice, every beating, every lynching in our county. Her fingers traced the lines on his palm. The sheriff confiscated those journals in 1962, said they were inciting unrest. Beat William so badly he lost sight in one eye. Darius swallowed hard. This was family history he hadn't heard before. But William had made copies, hidden them in the lining of your great-grandmother's hope chest. After the Civil Rights Act passed, those journals helped convict 3 former deputies of civil rights violations. She squeezed his hands. Documentation is power, child. Always has been, but power comes with risk. Dad always taught me to believe in the system, Darius whispered, to work within it. Your father is a good man. He teaches the history he hopes will be true someday. Grandma Olivia's eyes held generations of wisdom and weariness. But hope without action is just wishful thinking. Sometimes the system needs to be shocked into doing what it claims to do already. From downstairs came the sound of the doorbell, followed by Leona's surprised voice greeting someone. Moments later, footsteps on the stairs. Ms. Chen appeared in the doorway, legal briefcase in hand, expression grim. Darius, Mrs. Taylor? She nodded at Grandma Olivia. I've just received word from a clerk I trust. Judge Caldwell denied our motion to suppress Officer Thompson's testimony, despite the contradictions we identified. And... She hesitated, glancing at Darius. Say it, Grandma Olivia commanded. Principal Donovan has agreed to testify for the prosecution. They're going to bring up a student complaint from 3 years ago when Nathan broke up a fight. Claim it shows a pattern of physical interventions. The betrayal landed like a physical blow. Principal Donovan, who had recruited Nathan to teach at Westridge High, who had attended their family barbecues, who had promised just last month to stand by them. When it costs nothing, allies are everywhere, Grandma Olivia murmured. When it costs everything, you learn who your people really are. Darius turned back to his laptop, decision made. Ms. Chen, I need to show you something. I think I still have the recording. As the video loaded on his screen, the faces of the adults around him transformed. Hope, fear, and grim determination passing over them like storm clouds. In the harsh glow of the laptop, they formed a small circle of resistance against a system that had never been built to protect them in the first place. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Judge Caldwell's gavel slammed against wood repeatedly, the sound like gunshots in the tense air. Order! I will have order in this court! But the tide had already shifted. The tremor that had begun with Darius's 2 words, the recording, was now a seismic wave rippling through courtroom 317. Bailiff Martinez moved swiftly toward Darius, his face professionally neutral, but his eyes conflicted. Nathan Taylor half rose from his seat, instinctively turning toward his son, only to be firmly guided back by Ms. Chen. Your Honor, Ms. Chen called out, her voice cutting through the commotion with surprising authority. I request a brief recess to consult with this young man, who appears to have knowledge of evidence relevant to these proceedings. Judge Caldwell's complexion had shifted from ghostly white to mottled red. Ms. Chen, you know very well that unexpected outbursts from spectators are not grounds for... With all due respect, Ms. Chen interrupted, an action so rare in Caldwell's courtroom that several jurors visibly startled. If there is evidence that has been suppressed or tampered with, this court has an obligation to examine it. Ada Reynolds was on her feet now, straightening her jacket with hands that weren't quite steady. Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate attempt to delay proceedings. The defense has had ample time for discovery. Any alleged recording would have been part of that process if it existed. If it existed, Darius repeated, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos. but someone made sure it didn't exist anymore, or thought they did. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. A middle-aged white woman in the third row leaned forward, suddenly attentive. The court reporter's fingers hovered above her stenotype machine, eyes darting between the judge and the teenager who had dared disrupt his courtroom. Judge Caldwell's fingers whitened around his gavel. "Young man, I am holding you in contempt of court. Bailiff, remove him and—" "William." Grandma Olivia's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade, addressing the judge by his first name. She rose to her full height beside Darius, her 73 years carried with dignity that commanded attention. "We've known each other a long time, since before you wore that robe, since before you decided who deserved justice and who didn't." The courtroom fell silent. No one, not even Judge Caldwell, seemed to breathe. "Mrs. Taylor," Judge Caldwell managed finally, his tone caught between authority and something that might have been shame. "This is highly inappropriate." "What's inappropriate," Grandma Olivia continued as if he hadn't spoken, "is what happened to that recording. What's inappropriate is what's been happening in this courtroom for decades." She placed a steadying hand on Darius's shoulder. "My grandson has evidence that was deliberately destroyed, and I think you know exactly why." The jurors were watching with undisguised interest now, several of them leaning forward. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine, capturing every word. "I've seen the video," Ms. Chen stated clearly, stepping away from the defense table. "I can attest that it directly contradicts Officer Thompson's testimony." This was only partially true. She had seen the video just days ago, not in time for normal discovery, but the gambit worked. Judge Caldwell's eyes darted to Officer Thompson, who had gone very still in his seat behind the prosecution table. "Your Honor," ADA Reynolds protested, "this alleged evidence hasn't been authenticated or properly submitted. The defense can't just spring this on us during closing arguments." "We didn't spring it," Ms. Chen replied evenly. "It was taken from Darius Taylor's phone while it was in police custody. The fact that it mysteriously reappeared through an automated cloud backup is the only reason we're having this conversation." Judge Caldwell seemed to be calculating rapidly behind his impassive expression. "Ms. Chen, approach the bench. Ms. Reynolds, you as well." As the attorneys approached, Darius remained standing, Grandma Olivia's hand firm on his shoulder. The weight of what he'd done pressed against his chest. His father turned in his chair, eyes meeting Darius's for the first time since the outburst. Fear, pride, and confusion mingling in his expression. At the bench, Judge Caldwell spoke in hurried whispers, but the acoustics of the old courtroom allowed fragments to reach the gallery. "Serious allegations. Officer Caldwell's involvement. My son has nothing to do with—" The last phrase, spoken more loudly than the judge intended, sent another ripple through the courtroom. Several heads turned toward Officer Thompson, connections being made. The middle-aged woman in the third row was now frantically typing on her phone. A court clerk near the judge's bench looked up sharply, eyes widening. Ms. Chen's voice rose just enough to be clearly heard. "Your Honor, are you acknowledging that Officer Thompson is your son?" The question hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Judge Caldwell straightened, visibly composing himself. "Step back, both of you." To the courtroom at large, he announced, "We will take a 30-minute recess. Jury is instructed not to discuss the case." As the judge rose to leave, Ada Reynolds made a small gesture toward Officer Thompson, who immediately stood and moved toward the side door. But his path was blocked by two suited individuals who had entered silently during the commotion. "Officer William Thompson, Jr., one of them asked, badge already extended. "Agent Morales, FBI. We'd like to ask you some questions about a pattern of civil rights complaints." The courtroom, which had begun to empty for the recess, froze again. Nathan Taylor half rose from his chair once more, this time in disbelief. "Dad," Darius said, his voice cracking, "I found more than our video. I found a pattern, other traffic stops, other black professionals, other cases in front of Judge Caldwell. All connected." Ms. Chen turned, genuine surprise on her face. "Darius, what did you do?" "I just followed the breadcrumbs. Each video from the cloud had metadata, location, date, time. I cross-referenced with court records, public information." Darius swallowed hard. "Then I sent it all to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division." The woman who had been typing on her phone in the third row stood up, press badge now visible on her lanyard. "Rebecca Martinez, County Times. I'd like to hear more about this pattern, Darius." Ada Reynolds was frantically gathering papers from the prosecution table, her carefully constructed case collapsing before her eyes. "This is completely inappropriate. The court is in recess, and this child has no standing to address." "My son," Nathan spoke finally, his voice steady despite the emotion visible on his face, "has every right to speak the truth, even when the system designed to protect that right fails him." The FBI agents were now escorting Officer Thompson from the courtroom, his face a mask of cold fury as he glanced back at Darius. Judge Caldwell had disappeared through his chamber doors, but the damage was done. In the center of the storm, Darius stood with his grandmother, feeling simultaneously powerful and terrified. This wasn't just about his father anymore. This was about pulling a thread that could unravel decades of injustice. "You understand what you've done?" Grandma Olivia asked softly, for his ears only. "There will be consequences. Powerful people don't surrender power quietly." Darius nodded, watching as reporters began to gather at the edges of the commotion. His father was embracing his mother now, both of them glancing his way with expressions he couldn't quite read. "I understand," he answered, "but I don't think I had a choice." "There's always a choice, child. You chose justice over comfort, truth over safety." Pride shone in her eyes. "Just like your great-grandfather did." The courtroom continued to buzz with activity around them, Ms. Chen conferring urgently with Nathan and Leona, reporters positioning themselves for statements, jurors whispering among themselves as they were led out. Through the large windows of courtroom 317, sunlight slanted across the polished wooden floors, illuminating dust motes that swirled in the disturbed air. "You know this isn't over," Grandma Olivia continued. "One corrupt judge, one biased officer, their symptoms, not the disease." Darius thought of all the hours he'd spent cross-referencing cases, searching for patterns, learning about civil rights law from YouTube videos and library books, because his family couldn't afford another attorney beyond Ms. Chen. The sleepless nights, when doubt had nearly overwhelmed him. The moment he'd pressed send on the email to the Justice Department, certain he was simply shouting into the void. "I know," he replied, watching as the reporter, Rebecca Martinez, approached them cautiously. "But it's a start." Ms. Chen appeared at their side, slightly breathless. "Darius, I don't know whether to scold you or thank you. The judge wants to see the evidence immediately. An official from the district attorney's office is on his way over. Apparently they've been building a case against Judge Caldwell for months, but didn't have enough to move forward." "Until now," Grandma Olivia said softly. "Until now," Ms. Chen agreed. She looked at Darius with new respect. "Your father is being processed for release. The DA's office is filing for immediate dismissal of all charges pending review." She hesitated. "But Darius, you should know, Judge Caldwell has powerful friends. This won't be easy for your family." From across the courtroom, Nathan caught Darius's eye and gave a small nod, acknowledgement, gratitude, and a silent promise to face whatever came next together. Darius straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of his actions and the strength of his lineage supporting him simultaneously. "Ms. Martinez," he said, turning to the reporter who had been patiently waiting nearby. "I'm ready to tell you what happened. All of it. From the beginning." As he began to speak, Darius felt something shift inside him. The transformation from a boy who trusted a broken system to a young man determined to hold that system accountable. His voice grew stronger with each word, carrying across the courtroom where, for generations, truth had too often been sacrificed on the altar of power and tradition. 6 weeks later, the Taylor family dining table looked different. Gone were the stacks of legal documents and unpaid bills that had dominated the surface for months. In their place stood a homemade chocolate cake with "Victory" written in Zora's uneven 7-year-old handwriting. "I still think we should have gotten it from the bakery," Leona said. But the smile that had returned to her face contradicted her words. "It's lopsided." "It's perfect," Nathan insisted, his arm around her shoulders. The strain hadn't completely left his face. Trauma didn't disappear with a dismissed case, but some essential part of him had returned. He was teaching again, reinstated with back pay and a formal apology from the school district. Darius watched his parents from the kitchen doorway, a complicated tangle of emotions in his chest. Relief, certainly. Pride in what they had accomplished together, but also a new wariness that he suspected would never fully disappear. The doorbell rang, and Zora raced to answer it, her braids bouncing. "Grandma's here," she announced unnecessarily as Grandma Olivia entered, followed by Ms. Chen and, surprisingly, Rebecca Martinez from the County Times. "Hope you don't mind the extra guest," Grandma Olivia said, hanging her coat on the rack by the door. "Rebecca has news she thought you'd want to hear in person." Nathan straightened, instinctively bracing himself. Good news had been so rare for so long that its possibility still triggered caution. "Please come in," Leona said, ever the gracious hostess, despite the uncertainty that flickered across her features. They gathered around the dining table, Zora insisting on serving everyone cake before the adults could protest. "First," Ms. Chen began, accepting a slightly crooked slice, "the formal part. Nathan, the school board has approved your proposal for the curriculum update, the one about including local civil rights history in the county's middle and high school history classes." Nathan's eyes widened slightly. The curriculum proposal had been his passion project for years, repeatedly sidelined by administrators who found it too controversial or not relevant to standardized testing. "That's unexpected," he managed, glancing at Darius. "Good, but unexpected." Several board members mentioned how they were inspired by recent events, Ms. Chen added with a slight smile. Apparently, having their dirty laundry aired makes people reconsider their priorities. "And speaking of dirty laundry," Rebecca Martinez continued, setting her untouched cake aside and opening her notebook, "that's why I wanted to speak with you directly. My investigation has uncovered 12 similar cases over the past 5 years alone. Black professionals targeted for traffic stops, escalated to resisting arrest or assault charges, then funneled through Judge Caldwell's courtroom." "All professionals?" Leona asked, her fork paused midway to her mouth. "Teachers, nurses, a civil engineer, 2 attorneys, a physician assistant," Rebecca confirmed. "All well respected in their fields. All with spotless records until these incidents. All making waves in some way. School board activism, hospital diversity initiatives, challenging zoning laws in historically redlined neighborhoods." "It wasn't random," Darius said quietly. "They were targeted because they were changing things." "Exactly," Rebecca nodded. "The FBI investigation has expanded to include 3 other officers besides Thompson, 2 court clerks, and a senior figure in the prosecutor's office. They're looking at potential RICO charges, treating it as an organized effort to intimidate and suppress civic engagement in the black community." Nathan leaned back in his chair, absorbing this. "And Judge Caldwell?" Rebecca's expression tightened. "Resigned, citing health concerns, Pension intact. The State Judicial Ethics Commission is investigating, but don't hold your breath, Grandma Olivia finished for her. Some consequences are better than none, but justice and consequences aren't always the same thing. A heavy silence settled over the table. The victory they were celebrating suddenly felt incomplete, complicated. "There's more," Ms. Chen said, breaking the silence. "The Taylor family's case has become something of a catalyst. 3 similar cases have been reopened based on the pattern evidence Darius compiled, and the county has agreed to implement mandatory body cameras with stricter penalties for technical malfunctions during arrests." Zora, who had been following the adult conversation with partial comprehension, tugged at Darius's sleeve. "Did you fix everything?" she asked, her young face earnest. The question hung in the air, its innocence highlighting the complexity of what had been accomplished, and what hadn't. "No, Zora," Darius answered honestly, meeting his sister's eyes. "Not everything, not even close." "But he helped," Nathan added, reaching across to squeeze his son's shoulder. "He showed extraordinary courage, and sometimes that's how change begins, not with fixing everything at once, but with refusing to accept the broken parts we're told to ignore." Later that evening, after their guests had departed and Zora had been tucked into bed, Darius sat on the front porch steps. The autumn air carried a slight chill, a reminder of seasons changing. His phone buzzed with another notification, the 5th today from students at neighboring schools, asking him to speak at their Black Student Union meetings. The front door opened behind him, and Nathan stepped out, 2 mugs of tea in hand. "Your mum thought you might want this," he said, offering one to Darius before settling beside him on the steps. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, steam rising from their mugs into the cool night air. "You know there's already backlash," Nathan said finally. 3 parents called Principal Donovan demanding I be removed from their children's classes. Someone left a voicemail at the house last night. Nothing explicit, just heavy breathing, but the message was clear. Darius nodded. He'd seen the social media posts, the comments under the news articles. For every message of support, there were whispers about playing the race card and undermining respect for law enforcement. "I thought winning would feel different," Darius admitted. "More final." Nathan's laugh held no bitterness, only a tired wisdom. "Justice isn't an endpoint, son. It's a direction we keep moving in." He took a sip of his tea. "I was wrong, you know, about working solely within the system. Sometimes the system needs to be challenged to live up to its own promises." A car drove slowly past their house for the 3rd time that evening. Both of them tracked it with their eyes until it disappeared around the corner. "Are you scared?" Darius asked softly. "Some days," Nathan admitted, "but I'm more determined than scared." He turned to face his son fully. "What about you? Any regrets?" Darius considered the question seriously. The past weeks had transformed him in ways he was still processing. His social circle had shifted, some friends drifting away, uncomfortable with his newfound activism, while others had drawn closer. Tyler Washington had brought 5 other students to Darius's house the weekend after the courtroom revelation, all of them with stories about encounters with police, all of them wanting to learn how to document and protect themselves. "No regrets," he answered finally. "But I keep thinking about what Grandma said about my great-grandfather's journals. How documentation has always been power. How many stories never got documented? How many still aren't?" Nathan nodded slowly. "That's why I push so hard for curriculum changes. History isn't just what happened. It's what gets recorded, preserved, taught." A comfortable silence fell between them again, broken only by the distant sound of a train and the chorus of night insects. "I'm thinking of starting a workshop," Darius said suddenly. "Teaching kids about their rights, how to safely document encounters with authorities, how to back up evidence." He glanced at his father. Ms. Rivera said I could use her classroom after school. Pride spread across Nathan's face. That's a powerful idea. It won't fix everything, Darius cautioned, echoing his earlier words to Zora. No, Nathan agreed, but it's a step in the right direction, and sometimes that's the best we can do. Take one step, then another, and keep moving toward what's right, even when the path seems impossibly long. From inside the house came the sound of Leona's voice, speaking animatedly on the phone. Through the window they could see her pacing the living room, gesturing occasionally. She'd been on calls like this nearly every evening, connecting with other families affected by similar injustices, coordinating with community organizers, speaking with attorneys about civil suits against the county. Your mother's building a coalition, Nathan observed. Started with 3 other families last week. Now there's 12. They're documenting patterns, pushing for policy changes. Like mother, like son. Darius smiled slightly. Nathan bumped his shoulder affectionately. Like your grandmother too. Activism runs in your blood. As they finished their tea in companionable silence, Darius noticed a car slowing in front of the house across the street. A young black boy, maybe 10 or 11, climbed out of the back seat. The child's father exited next, scanning the street with the automatic vigilance that had become second nature for so many. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, Nathan raising his mug in quiet acknowledgement, the neighbor returning a subtle nod. Dad, Darius said, the weight of his recent experiences settling into a newfound purpose. I want to use the settlement money for cameras, good ones, for the neighborhood watch program. Nathan studied his son's face in the porch light. That's a lot of responsibility. So is silence, Darius replied simply. The next day, Darius would stand before 30 students in Ms. Rivera's classroom, teaching them how to activate emergency recordings on their phones, how to set up automatic cloud backups, how to safely document interactions with authorities. The day after that, he would accompany his father to a community meeting about police oversight. The battle that had begun with 2 words in a courtroom would continue in classrooms, living rooms, and city council chambers. Not a single dramatic victory, but a sustained commitment to bearing witness and demanding accountability. As father and son sat on their porch steps that evening, watching over their neighborhood with clear eyes and resolute hearts, the question hung unspoken in the autumn air. In a system built on centuries of inequality, is exposing one injustice enough? What would it take for truth to become more powerful than tradition? And if a child can summon the courage to speak truth to power, what's stopping the rest of us?